And to go further into this topic, we now welcome Hassan Ben Imran, legal advisor for human rights organization Law for Palestine. Thank you, Hassan, for joining us here in From the South.
Thank you, Van.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. So let's get right into it. For the past year, the world has been waiting, demanding for a ceasefire in Gaza, with many instances of negotiations that have led nowhere. And finally, on Wednesday, the deal was announced by the Qatari Prime Minister, and it is expected to come into force on Sunday. But the attacks have stepped up since that moment. So I wanted to ask you, just how significant is this deal for the situation in Palestine? What situation will we have on Sunday?
Of course. Allow me to start by saying that this is one of the moments in history where you stand up and you think, why did this happen only now? This is a moment that has been being pushed for by human rights organizations, by different governments, by the International Court of Justice itself. Many months ago, from the very beginning of the war, everyone was talking about ending this genocide, stopping the bloodshed. And as we can see, the deal that has been agreed upon today in the morning or last night is almost the same that has been discussed many months ago. Nothing has changed except for losing many lives, many innocent lives. We're talking about almost 10,000 people that lost their lives ever since almost the very same deal has been put on the table back in May and June last year. Just yesterday, after the news of the ceasefire, we lost a very dear colleague of ours, the head of the Independent Commission for Human Rights, the director actually of the commission, and a commissioner in the Human Rights Commission, the Palestinian National Commission in Gaza, Mr. Rifat Salha, who lost his life together with his wife and many of his cousins and his children as well. And that was after the news of the deal has been delivered. This is one of the scariest moments in human history. It's an actual full-fledged genocide that we're waiting the ICJ to deliberate on and deliver a decision on. Yet, it was shocking that what happened yesterday or today in the morning, depending on the news, which source that we rely on, is something that could have happened more than a year ago, saving the lives of these innocent people.
So exactly following that line of thought, why now and not then? Some things have changed, of course, in the geopolitical scene. We have President Trump that is about to take office once again. Do you think that this comes into place? What has changed for this to be a scenario now when it could have been this in May or many months before?
As you can see on the ground, there is almost nothing that has changed in Gaza. The bloodshed was going on. The genocide is going on. The suffering never stopped. The fighting on the ground never stopped. Israel claims to hold certain territories, but then it loses control quite fast. On the ground, I don't see any indication that anything has changed. It's almost identical. The only thing that has changed is the death toll, the number of victims killed. That's the only thing, and the friends and the people that we lost. Geopolitically, there might have been some changes that pushed Netanyahu to sign the deal. We have been looking at the discussions that he's been having with Ben Gvir and Smotrich, two ministers of the more radical ministers, actually more radical than Netanyahu himself, in the Israeli cabinet. And the agreement was that they will step down from the government, apparently, as per the latest news, but without causing the government to collapse. Either way, that doesn't indicate that Israel is showing any intent to stop this genocide. The ceasefire has been signed. We need now guarantees that Israel will not go back to continue this genocide. And we can say that the genocide has stopped because the suffering of the people did not end yet. And we're not sure about the amount of humanitarian aid that has entered Gaza yet. We're not sure about the medical facilities and the capacity to reconstruct the completely collapsed health system in Gaza. So on the ground, there is not much that has changed since the many months. Probably it's the change in American politics that has pushed Netanyahu to take this decision. Either way, this requires so much further pressure to make sure that Israel does not go back to to deploy its army in Gaza and to continue this bloodshed.
And exactly in that way, I wanted to ask you, we know from past experiences that a ceasefire does not equal the complete and end to all aggressions towards Palestinians, of course, in this case. So also for the past 15 months, Israel has been completely disregarding all its obligations to basically any international entity. So in this scenario, we said some geopolitical aspects have changed, but what can we expect in terms, can we rely on Israel's word in this case in terms of the ceasefire? What do you see coming in the coming months?
Short answer is absolutely not. Like, forgive my honesty, but only a fool would trust Israeli government in its current format. We have seen this quite lately in Lebanon. Israel did sign a peace treaty, or like a truce, a ceasefire with Lebanon, yet quite little has changed on the ground. Israel continued targeting Lebanon, continued actually having foot on the ground in South Lebanon until this very moment, and we're talking about more than a month, like a month and 10 days probably, since the agreement has been signed or has been agreed upon, and yet Israel is violating its responsibility towards the ceasefire agreement with Lebanon, or with the fighting paramilitary in Lebanon. The same applies to Syria. Israel is advancing within the Syrian territory without clearly stating its own military goals. There now, the Israeli troops are almost 20 kilometers away from Damascus, the capital of Syria. And Syria, at least the current formula that is governing Syria, has not posed any threats to Israel, yet Israel is acting, treating them as a foe and as an enemy. So we have we have quite much evidence to indicate the opposite, which means that this is a moment for us, for people concerned about international law, people working on the rule of law internationally, to keep pushing for a further action to prevent the Israeli cabinet and the Israeli government from redeploying its forces into Gaza. The levels of trust is close to non-existent. We have sufficient evidence to indicate that Israel will not abide by its obligations. Like, in order to suggest otherwise, we need quite an argument to be able to argue that we can be secure about Israel not re-invading Gaza or redeploying its troops and inflicting serious life conditions on the people of Gaza. What needs to be done is further pressure. Unfortunately, the streets have got used to the massacres happening in Gaza. Less pressure has been expressed or exerted from activists, from academics who were quite active in the beginning of the war, from people and NGOs organizing different protests in London and other capitals to pressure the governments to actually exert actual pressure on Israel. What needs to be done, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many people that have been working on this for the past 15 months, is that Israel will stop only when they face a sufficient pressure that makes them realize that they're going to lose more if they continue in this line of action. What does that mean? That means military embargo. That means economic boycott. That means also unseating Israel from the United Nations. Israel is disrespecting publicly the United Nations, shutting down the UNRWA, which is a UN agency, publicly disrespecting the UN Secretary General, disrespecting the UN, and actually banning many of the UN officials from coming into its territory. Perhaps this is a moment where we remember what happened to South Africa, apartheid regime in South Africa, when the Bouteflika rule was activated at that time, with Algeria and other countries pushing for dismissing Israeli diplomats from the United Nations facilities. And that happened. South Africa, the apartheid regime of South Africa, was unseated from the UN. That isolated the apartheid regime in South Africa further, which created further pressure on them to realize that the only way to end this is to respect their obligations according to international law, and to respect the bare minimum of human morality, of dismantling the apartheid regime that has been constructed in South Africa back then. The same is applicable to Israel, in my opinion.
And in terms of stepping up that international pressure, you were mentioning before the case at the ICJ that is at the moment continuing to investigate the ongoing genocide in Palestine. So in terms of this ceasefire agreement from an international law perspective, could, if the agreement was not followed, if what it's agreed upon in terms of the entry of humanitarian aid, for example, of the assistance to the Palestinians in Gaza, if this is not kept, as we imagine could very well happen, as you were just saying, could that just add some arguments into that international pressure to be able to be stepped up and enforced on behalf of different either other countries or the mediators themselves? Does the ceasefire agreement bind them in some way in that sense?
The ceasefire agreement is meant to be binding on the warring parties, binding on third parties as well, third states, binding on the UN, on the third states that are financing the Israeli genocide. Israel the Israeli ammunition is coming from the US, Germany, and other states. 70% is coming from the US, which means that it is binding on these states. The very idea that an agreement has been signed reinforces the calls and the demands and the action, the line of action that's being taken. Any Israeli action against the ceasefire further reinforces the South African case in the ICJ. So absolutely, the ceasefire is binding. It does end much of the unnecessary disputes, like intellectual conversations or practice intellectual exercises that are being practiced by some people here and there. This is an agreement that has been signed by the directly involved parties, that has been directly co-sponsored by the other parties that have been contributing to the situation, mainly the United States. So yes, it's binding. It should be upheld, and there has to be a step forward to reconstruct Gaza and allow the people of Gaza to be able to resume a sense of normal life, which I can't imagine how that is possible after what they've been through, but at least in the sense of reconstructing the completely destroyed the health system, the hospitals, the access to aid, access to humanitarian aid, to medical aid, so on and so forth.
So, of course, we hope that this binding quality is upheld and is enforced by the mediators, along which are some very important nations, as you were mentioning. So we'll have to see what happens, of course, in the coming days. Thank you, Hassan, so much for joining us in From the South with such a clear perspective that allows us to further understand this topic. Advisor at Law for Palestine and also PhD scholar at the University of Galway. We now go for a short break, but stay with us.